Good afternoon and welcome to the first broadcast of Book Lovers Corner for 2019. We are being broadcast by Wairarapa Community Access on Wairarapa Community Access radio station Arrow FM 92.7, and we are recording every fourth Tuesday of the month from 3:30 to 4:30 throughout the year. This is one of 12 community access radio stations in New Zealand, and we are sponsored by our wonderful independent bookshop in Carterton, Elmo's Books. It has a Facebook page that you may well find very interesting. You can listen to our program live online by connecting in with Arrow FM, or listen later via the podcast, which you can download onto your device. When you log into Arrow FM's website, you'll see a list down the left-hand side which has podcasts, then listen live. Select the option you want, look for the Book Lovers Corner and click on it. We'd appreciate any feedback that you offer, or you can offer by contacting the station's Facebook page. Indicating a like for the program would help us to find out more about our as yet unknown audience. We do know we have some local, national and international listeners. This year we have a slightly new team fronting the program. I'm Valda Kirkwood, and I've been part of the team for the past 3 years. The other members of the team are Gareth Rapson and Sue Lawrence, both of whom have been contributors in the past 3 years. As Sue was up in Auckland on a date with Billy Shakespeare, her words, at the Globe, a past member of the team, Julie Crossland, has joined us and will be an occasional contributor throughout the year. Welcome, Gareth, to the Book Lovers Corner.
Good afternoon.
And welcome, Julie. Welcome back, Julie.
Good afternoon.
So the beginning of this session, we will be having a program of discussion, and then we will be focusing on each of the three of us having read a particular book. So we're going to start at the moment for Julie, who will discuss her book, which is Karen Hayes' Winged Helmet, White Horse. Over to you, Julie.
Thank you, Valda. Well, this book I found in Elmo's Books just before Christmas. And usually I buy myself a book as a Christmas present just before Christmas. So I was looking for something to buy, and I came across this book, Karen Hay. Now, Karen Hay, she's an award-winning writer, and her debut novel, Emerald Budgies, won the NZSA Hubert Church Best First Book Award. And her last novel, The March of the Foxgloves, was a #1 bestseller on the New Zealand fiction list. She's a Frank Sargison Fellow, a Michael King resident, literary advisor to the Frank Sargison Trust, and mentor for the NZSA. She's recently started as a presenter on Radio New Zealand National, and I was surprised because I recognised the name. I had no idea she was a writer. I remember her from, I think it was the 80s. Back then she was a presenter for Radio with Pictures on the TV.
Actually, I can really remember that really quite well. She was a striking young redhead, if I remember, and
yes.
just was the most kind of alternative television,
yes.
Showing these clips of bands that we had never heard of, and introducing, I think, all of us of that age group to music we'd never heard of.
Exactly, yes. It was sort of quite edgy music, wasn't it?
That's the word.
Yeah.
It was, and she was pretty sparkly.
She was.
Yeah.
She was. And so I was very impressed. I thought, I had no idea, so I picked it up. I read the blurb at the back and thought, yes, this is for me. So It's her third novel, and it's set in contemporary London. I know that she's lived in the UK for some years, so she has that kind of advantage in terms of setting a novel in London. It's described as a darkly comic psychological novel. Its themes explored are marriage, friendships, relationships, and children. And I was puzzled about the title. What did it mean? Winged helmet, white horse. And so I went and looked and checked and found that the winged helmet in this instance refers to Hermes. In Greek mythology, it's in Roman mythology, it's the name escapes me. It'll come to me in a moment. Hermes, so in Greek mythology, Hermes is the messenger for the gods, and he escorts souls to the afterlife. He's the god of merchants, shepherds, athletics, literature, and thieves. And so I was puzzled by this, and I wondered about also the reference to the white horse. So I thought, has that got anything to do with the white horses, chalk horses on the hillside? There was a number of them in the UK dotted about on the hillsides. I couldn't make any connection there. So I looked up white horse on the internet, and from earliest times, white horses have been mythologised as possessing exceptional properties, transcending the normal world by having wings, having horns, i.e. the unicorn, and there are also white horses that prophesy or warn of danger. So that's about as much as I want to say about it, because otherwise going into it too much will give away the narrative.
Julie, the title, does it work? I mean, the end, are you any wiser about the title?
It's a bit well, when you get to the end and you reflect on it, you can see where she's going with it. It seemed very tenuous throughout the novel.
I found a little disconnect just
yes.
looking at the story and the title, but and let's face it, titles are how the words, how the book kind of gets its cachet out in life, and it just. But I'm sure if Karen was sitting here with us, she'd give us an idea, erudite explanation of why it works.
Yes.
And interestingly, when I looked up an interview with her with Book Lovers website in New Zealand, it was set in Hampton in London,
Southwest,
in Middlesex, where she apparently lived herself, and some of her formative child rearing years were there. So that whole business about rearing a child in London,
yes,
which she in the book she goes into in some detail.
Yes,
and interestingly, she expects parents to find that humorous. But I think from our conversations, you haven't found that to be the case at all.
No.
I seem to recall you saying it was unremittingly grim.
Yep, absolutely.
Which brings up the question of who wants to read a book that's unremittingly grim,
yes.
And that's what comes out of this grimness.
Well, you'd like to think that there'd be some leavening of it. And I'll as I could just go through the narrative a bit, because, as I say, the reference to the winged helmet and the white horse does give you a clue to what might happen, but so it is also, if I go into it too much, it could be considered a spoiler. So the narrative is that there's the main character. His name's Tim. He's struggling with a serious alcohol problem and tinnitus, and he's had a critically acclaimed first book of poetry published, and he's struggling to write a second. So in order to support him and his wife and child, he's working at a music equipment hire place. He's married to Natasha, who seems to hate him and has nothing but contempt for him. And although I'm giggling now as I think about it, I think she really does. She has utter contempt, and it's not nice at all. It's quite a toxic relationship. So they have a 3-year-old daughter called Marigold, and Marigold is resisting Tim and Natasha's attempts to have her toilet trained in time for her to go to a posh private preschool. And the drive to go to this private school is being driven by Natasha. She dreams about, so Natasha dreams about what she can wear for the school drop-off, and wouldn't these little shoes just be gorgeous and for the other mothers to admire. She likes to spend money, and she's into affirmation, so you get a sense of sort of quite facile and superficiality with Natasha. Just going back to the preschool, they can't afford it, so Natasha's leaning on her mother to pay for the fees. Tim would rather Marigold goes to the state-run facility. And in the novel, Karen Hay goes into quite some detail about the gruesomeness of the problems with toilet training of Marigold. It's gruesome, and you get a sense that this is coming from her reality.
And perhaps she expects parents to be familiar with that, and neither of us being parents can perhaps. Right. But Gareth, would that connect with you? Too long ago.
Too long, yeah, it's too long ago. But what I am thinking as I'm listening to this, is this a London book? I mean, she's such a Kiwi.
I know, it's very interesting. It's interesting. It is very much a London book about how, having lived in London myself, how difficult it is sometimes to get around, the traffic. You want to go somewhere in the car, you spend 4 hours, getting halfway there. It's the frustrations. She really taps into the frustrations and difficulties in getting around and about and just sort of living your life. And at the time it's written, there's a lot of, it's very hot, and so that just adds to the frustration and
Julie, that's why we
problems.
Live in the wonderful Wairarapa, to escape
right.
the sort of weirdness of London life. So
not only is Marigold not only are they having trouble with Marigold, the cat is also having its own psychological problems and is being all over the house. So Marigold and the cat are but reflections of the deep problems between Tim and Natasha. Natasha's best friend is Claire, an accountant, and her husband Gareth, Gareth appears to do very little. And I found them a completely gruesome and unlikable pair. I did not like them at all. Have I got time to... Okay, very quickly. Tim, I found a very likeable character. He's desperately trying to get some control over his life. The tinnitus is driving him mad, and he's been to a specialist and a psychotherapist, but he's in dire need of decent psychological help for him to deal with his alcohol problem, and also there are a number of strategies you can use to deal with tinnitus. He's been going to AA, and he's actually been able to stop drinking for a period of time, but relapse is spectacular. So, as I said, I really disliked Natasha. I found the characters very well drawn and believable, but, as I said, unremittingly grim. While the blurb describes it as darkly comic, I didn't find it at all funny. I was really engaged with it, and I really wanted Tim to get some control over his life. But basically, Tim is disintegrating.
It feels almost like we're kind of not the target audience of a book like this. This is a book for a younger sort of young married couple, sort of handling parenting and all the stresses and strains of modern contemporary life in London. I think this book would struggle to find an audience in New Zealand just by the pure London setting. But I haven't read it, and would you actually rate it? There's something that
as I say, I found it very well written. She's a very good writer, and the descriptions of being in London and being a parent, having friends. Yep, there are some things to recommend it. Yep, and I would give it about a 7 give it about 7 out of 10. But as I say, I found it quite grim.
Well, I think now we might go into thinking about or talking about books that have come up since our last Christmas episode, which was in fact recorded in November, and now. And I have in fact got the best seller lists from both Elmo's and from Nelson's, Page and Blackmore, the independent shop Page and Blackmore and Nelson, whom I used to haunt when I lived down in Nelson. And I've also had a look through the New Zealand listeners 100 reads for 2018. And I think we have all got contributions to that conversation. And I think that conversation will take us up to the music interlude before we start the second half of the program. So, Gareth, do you want to...
Well, I noticed the first book that's sort of listed here is Lee Child's latest book, Past Tense. You read this?
Yes, that was for Elmo's, wasn't it?
Right.
Elmo's. It was in fact Elmo's top seller for the 1st of December to the 11th of January, and which Sue kindly whipped up the top 10. And yes, I've read it, and I always enjoy it, but it's also an easy read. It's not one that you have to think about. You get into it, it pulls you through. He raises very interesting issues. He's always very topical. And I think the last one I gave a review of, he was dealing with drugs, particularly medicinal type of drugs, that were needed by but not provided for people injured, war vets from Afghanistan, Iraq and so on, who have been disabled in various ways and who are then booted out of the system fairly quickly without any sort of resolution of the issues that they have got from their service. And that was for me very interesting because it's not a story you find out there generally in the media. Yeah. But this one, briefly...
it's a good, quick, typical 21 in the series of Jack Reacher's, the sort of avenger for all of us, and they're hugely popular. There's a stat in the back of the book, I think, where it says one's bought somewhere around the world every minute or two. So they've made Mr. Childs a very, very wealthy man, and we're all kind of delighted that Tom Cruise has let the movie thing go, and then now the movies are going to be shot through Amazon with a new Jack Reacher. So we're all looking forward to that.
Yes, because the image of Jack Reacher and Tom Cruise just didn't match.
Yeah. Never worked. So I think the world was agreed on that. I read another book off the list, which is on our book club is coming up to it, called Paris Echo, Sebastian Faulks' latest book. Really good book. For people who may have had a chance to live in Paris or travel around on the metro, and here we have a tale of a young Algerian man meeting up with an American researcher and looking at the echoes of past lives in Paris. Beautifully written, as Faulks always is, and highly recommended. Now Another one is The Gentleman in Moscow, was in my top 5 books of last year. Terrifically interesting tale of an aristocrat sort of almost imprisoned in Moscow's top hotel, and the narrative of this extraordinary life is beautifully written. And Amour Towels, I can't say enough about it. I think it's in our local library system, and a wonderful read.
Now, Julie, do you want to comment on the books that you've perhaps read over the last couple of months,
yes.
and Elmo's and
Right.
bestsellers?
I've read Educated by Tara Westover, and that's the story of a young girl growing up in Utah, isn't it? I think you've read it, haven't you, Valda?
Yes, I have read it.
And she's growing up in this Mormon family, and she's never been to school. And her father is she discovers later her father is paranoid and quite deluded, and has what she then realises at a later stage has bipolar disorder. So they're living a survivalist life, and hoarding food and stockpiling weapons and all sorts of things in order for the end of the world to come. And she decides so she hasn't been to school, she's not even registered as her birth. So at a later stage, I think when she's about 15, she decides to educate herself. Quite an extraordinary story about having got away from this family, and she started to educate herself, went to school. She really did so well that she won a scholarship to Oxford, I think it was, and then at a later stage went to Harvard, and where she got a PhD. Extraordinary how she managed that with such a bereft of ideas, and her upbringing so empty, and so that's very, very well worth a read.
That book's getting a lot of critical attention, and once again available at Elmo's, and a very, very challenging book by the sound of it. I notice on the list here we've got Craig Smith's Wonky Donkey. Now, probably this man has probably made more money from writing than probably any other New Zealand author. What's the story here?
Well, I knew it had there had been a resurgence in recent months, and talking with Sue in Elmo's, she was saying about this video of a grandmother reading the Wonky Donkey to her grandchild in Scotland. And so I went online, I went into YouTube, and the grandmother just is in fits. She gradually, goes through the book and starts off smiling and then sort of laughing, and by the end of it she's killing herself. And I think it's the most delightful excerpt of a grandmother reading to a grandchild but enjoying the book herself. And in fact, Craig Smith had said it was sold out. UK and US Amazon was sold out in the last couple of months, and they now have a new print run of 40,000 books. Now, this is 10 years on since it was published, and it is a book that I've given to friends when they've had babies, particularly with the CD attached to it. And I just think it's wonderful that a New Zealand book has got such a children's book. Is becoming it's on Elmo's bestsellers of the last couple of months, and I'm sure it's going to be, certainly a New Zealand bestseller.
Wonky Donkey 2 coming up, you think?
Can you actually get, can Wonky Donkey be superseded?
No, it is certainly the publishing story of the year, really. I notice in front of you've got Storm Boy, which has probably got our attention with the new movie release.
Yes, I've went to my shelf and got the Storm Boy off my shelf, which I had bought years and years ago when it was initially published. And then the film attracted us all, I think, at that particular time. Now, I gather that I've just read a review about the new film that doesn't sort of match up to the delight of the old film. I gather it's trying to include, environmental awareness so much into it that it just loses its impact. What was your sense from what you've read?
Much the same, but I guess readers are hoping is that it'll send people back to the book.
Oh.
And it actually was a big book in New Zealand, and the movie, the simple book, simple, straightforward movie, and it was much loved. And I think it's that good that it could find its readership again.
Well, another one that's still ongoing after all these years is Dame Linley Dodd's Harry McCleary. That is extraordinary. I mean, that's another publishing phenomenon. It's it's a book I've often given to friends when they've had wee ones and family. And it is, Wonky Donkey was first on the bestseller lists at Elmo's for children's books. Harry McCleary was fourth. I mean, so they're still up there. They're really good, solid children's books that have lasted the distance.
Right. What about non-fiction? Anyone been reading anything interesting in the non-fiction world?
No, not at the moment.
Not at the moment.
I've just finished reading the latest Rivers of London series called Lie Sleeping by Ben Aranovich, and that's a meld of it features a policeman, a London policeman on the beat, but he also it combines magic, and it's a very popular series, and that's the latest one. Ben Aranovich actually wrote some episodes of Doctor Who, so that gives you a bit of a clue about the fantasy side of it, which I don't normally like. I'm not really into the fantasy genre, but this is a very attractive.
But you
series.
Introduced us to the series when you came back from London a few years ago, having read it over there.
That's right.
And gone on your trip to Paris and picked up another one.
That's right.
And introduced us, all of us, to it. And we've talked about it as a thread through the last few years.
Yes.
And I too read that. And I like Lee Child. It's fun.
Yes, it's fun and
through.
Absolutely, it's very engaging. You love the characters, and
It also gives you a lot of you get involved with the history and the geography of London in a way that you don't otherwise get.
That's right. Yes.
And I find that really interesting.
Yes, in fact, when I first picked it up, the first novel was called Rivers of London, and I thought, that's going to be interesting. I thought it was a non-fiction book about the rivers of London, and I knew a bit about some of the lost rivers too, but it wasn't that at all. And another one I've read, I'm just about finished it, by a writer called Penelope Lively, and she's one of my favourite writers. She won the Booker Prize in the 80s, around the 80s, with a book called Moon Tiger, and this is not her latest, but it's called How It All Began, and the central character is Charlotte, who's an older woman, and she's mugged, set in London, she's mugged and breaks her hip, and the ripples that radiate out from that one event is is the focus of it, and how other people get impacted upon it, even people who don't know that other people in the novel exist. So that's a nice book too, a good book. She's a great writer.
Here's a bit of non-fiction. This Feel Great and Live Longer by Jason Bennett, and you pick up a book like this and you go, how can you actually find something new and interesting to say about diets and living well. I mean, magazines and, you know, breakfast TV and the media endlessly circle around this topic, and I thought this is going to be, you know, a bit of a is it going to make it? But in fact, it's got a couple of pluses. It is a New Zealand book, and he tells our stories. He reflects back on his health issues and how he solved them by eating, you know, well and all that. But the bit that I really found was quite good was he kind of challenged New Zealanders to rethink alcohol and how it's the part it plays in our lives. And he'd done a lot of research in this, and it's kind of sobering to think that like about 10% of doctors' consultations have alcohol issues tacked away in behind them in New Zealand, that it's a bit bigger than we sometimes think. And that is the key sort of message in a book like this. And it's a quick flick through, find things that interest you, and it challenges you about how much you drink, and it also it sort of just makes us look at the coffee industry and the role that plays. All the things we love, having a glass of wine and having our flat whites, are all kind of, he says, just, you know the other side of it. But it's a kind of sort of a book that you have the feeling it's a kind of promotional book for himself, for his own industry, which is being a health coach and a public speaker. And I imagine you go along and see him speak, and in the end you get a signed copy of the book.
Thank you, Gareth. Thank you, Julie. We'll go now to a short musical break, and we'll come back to you afterwards, and Gareth will talk about his Murakami book. Right, we're back. Welcome back to the Book Lovers Corner at Arrow FM 92.7 every fourth Tuesday of the month from 3:30 to 4:30 in the afternoon. Also on Freeview Channel 41, able to be listened to live and downloaded into a podcast onto your device. And welcome back to Gareth and Julie. Now, Gareth, are you going to talk to us about your Murakami book?
Right. Haruki Murakami's latest, Killing Commendatori. Now, this comes in at 680 pages. This is a challenge for you. And though he's written about 14 books, it seems like about every fourth or fifth one becomes a very large book. And it's normally I'm if a book's over 400 pages, I don't know about you two, but I'm kind of looking at it a little bit like a bit warily, but I'm such a fan of Murakami that I happily picked it up. The story very quickly is our 30-year-old portrait painter living in Tokyo splits from his wife. She's met someone else, and he takes off driving around down the coast of Japan, and then a friend says, look, you can stay in my house of my father, a very, very famous artist, use his studio, and it's, so he accepts this and arrives up in this big valley, which is beautifully Japanese, misty, atmospheric, and he settles in and into life in his studio. Across the valley is this fabulous house, beautifully lit, and he learns it's owned by a sort of reclusive billionaire, and he looks across from his deck to this deck, and there's a link here to The Great Gatsby, and in fact the book in a way is a sort of homage to Gatsby. I mean, it's almost like Nick looking over at Gatsby's mansion. And anyway, he settles in, and then one day he goes up into the attic and finds a painting which is wrapped in brown paper, and he takes it, undoes it, and it's a stunningly challenging painting of the scene from the opening of Don Giovanni the opera. Now, in the opening of Don Giovanni, the Knight Commander, of which Murakami calls him the Commendatore, is confronting Don Giovanni, who has seduced the people of the young ladies of the city, and he is confronting him with a list. As he does this, he realizes his daughter's name is on the list, and he is very, very upset. Don Giovanni laughs and takes the sword out and kills him in the opening scene of the opera in a very dramatic sort of way. That's the painting, is this killing of the Knight's Commander, Commendatore, and it's powerful, but for some reason when he takes it out of its packet, it sets in motion a whole lot of things. And in the book we are going to get a bell that rings mysteriously at night, a precocious 13-year-old who lives down the valley and who sort of comes swirling into the story. We're going to get the idea of monks who were entombed in wells, and we're going to meet a figure from the painting, a 2-foot figure, the Commendatore, as a manifestation of an idea. He is going to be pursued by double metaphors. The strange tale, which is so Murakami, is set in motion, and we are swept along. Gulp this book down, and it's interesting. This book had a print run in Japan of 1.3 million copies. I mean, Murakami is a world sort of renowned author, and I mean, his books are translated into 50 languages. He is, what's interesting, he writes them in Japanese and then gets them translated by a guy, J. Rubin, that used to do it, new translators now. But he's an excellent speaker of English himself, and he himself translates Scott Fitzgerald's English books and Raymond Carver back into Japanese. So he could write it in English, but he prefers a translated sort of version. Why? I'm not quite sure. Writes non-fiction, writes short stories, just a world, and often has lived outside of Japan and has been criticised for not being totally a Japanese writer. But if there's one writer in Japan that's found his way into the West or into the sort of worldwide reading, it is Haruki Murakami.
Thank you, Gareth. I've not ever read him at all.
No, I haven't either.
It's kind of like magic realism. It's all going normal, and then suddenly something is slightly takes you. I mean, suddenly they're I think the books are super. This book has had a lot of criticism for being a little bit all of his old ideas just recycled one more time. I love it because it's a lot about art, which is a great interest of mine. But there's been funny little bingo cards of all his ideas, put up on the net, and reviewers have had a sort of mixed reaction. Even Michael from this radio station has not, who's a big reader of Murakami, has said that this is not his favourite. But saying that, I would really pitch it. It would be, a lot of his books are quite slim, so there may be the way to get into Murakami.
Right.
And but for someone who's willing to take a big plunge into what I think sort of demonstrates him at his very best, because I am such a fan, would find this really good.
Thank you, Gareth. I might start reading one of the slimmer versions.
Me too, I think.
But I can see how attractive it is when you've got that art focus as well. Do all of his books have that art focus?
Not at all. This is really the only one. They're usually about young sort of Japanese men and the lives and challenges of them. But there's always a sort of an alternative reality in some of them, just one step away. And sometimes you step and you find yourself in this strange, kind of slightly different world where everything seems like it's normal, but it's not. And I think he's unlike anyone who's writing. He sort of has a sort of little own niche that you either step into his world and love. And to me, and I have a sort of, one of the attractions is I'm attracted by Japanese ideas and thinking, and that, so that's why I've been led to Haruki.
Yeah. But that actually segues well, that whole business about things not necessarily being what they seem, into the book that I want to focus on, which is Michael Ondaatje's Warlight. Now, we've all read it. So I'll briefly go through it, and you might like to add comments onto that. The listener summary, it is one of the listeners' 100 good reads for 2018, and their summary is: the English patient author takes on another intriguing forensic search for truth, this time in the back streets of post-war London, to reveal the story of a missing mother's war service. So that's sort of it in a nutshell. But I find that very missing a lot of the point of the book and the richness and the depth of the book, which is just so fulfilling to read. I mean, we talked about Lee Child's latest book. I read it prior to reading Warlight, and you just rush through Lee Child's and that's it. But you read Warlight by Michael Ondaatje, and it keeps on resonating in different layers. for a long time after. I mean, it's about 3 weeks since I finished reading it, and I still come up with images. So basically, it's the story of a lad called Nathaniel, who in his 30s is trying to reconstruct his sense of self by examining what happened in his younger years. And so the book starts when he's 14, and he is abandoned by his parents in post-war London. I mean, it seems an extraordinary situation. You have both parents ostensibly going off together for his father's top international business job over in Singapore. And, you know, and he sees his mother packing her. She leaves belatedly after the father, but, you know, packing her case, and saw all that. And they are then left in charge or being looked after by this guy they call the Moth, who seems to be a very mysterious character. And who then, their home, they remain in their family home.
Because there's the older sister Rachel too, though. So
that's
Nathaniel
right.
and Rachel,
yes.
who's 2 years older.
Yes, that's right. And so Nathaniel and his older sister Rachel are in the family home with the Moth, who then creates a very sort of gregarious atmosphere in the home with all sorts of interesting odd bods coming to and fro. And because Nathaniel wasn't settling well at school, the Moth got him jobs in hotels. He got a job with a friend of the Moth's, ending up going on barges up in and about Thames waterways.
Wonderful scenes.
Absolutely, and they're the sort of scenes, it's the scenes on the barge that keep on resonating. They keep on coming back to me. They're so vividly written. And it's all to do with, you know, sort of getting greyhounds in from Europe, and them being doped up. It was an amazing sort of story about the greyhound industry, and one wonders if that still exists today, because there keeps on being sort of information both in Australia and Britain about the greyhound industry, and that could well have started back then. And so you get all this richness of these different sort of people that he meets and how their lives intersect. And then they continue on into his discovery later on about his mother, who hadn't joined her husband over in Singapore, but who'd in fact been a spy in post-war.
They discovered that she hadn't gone because that Nathaniel and Rachel discovered that her trunk had been, you know, hidden in the cellar, and that she hadn't gone off to Singapore.
And so I don't want to give too much more away,
Right.
because, you know, there are some spoilers there, really.
Yes.
I think, but I think it focuses on a number of different things, like sort of the multi-layers it focuses on, like abandonment of children, and we talked about abandonment before when we were talking about...
We mentioned, like, the English Patient, where she is abandoned in the caves, and so it's been touched on before by Michael.
There's also the use of... I like the term, I was talking about it with a friend, and I said the title was Warlight. She said, well, that doesn't tell me anything. But actually, when you read the book, that murkiness of post-war London with its bombed out remains.
Got the feeling, you know, the sort of low-level electricity where everything... I mean, I remember, like he mentions at one stage, there was a single light on London Bridge, one tiny light. And the idea that everything's dim and in the shadows. In fact, the whole book is life in the shadows.
Yes, and you know, sort of going out on the Thames barge in the middle of the night, you know, and then finding their way back without any lights, driving his taxi through London with no lights, and what all that involved. And so through that you also learn, I think the title reflects all that very, very well. The other layer is you learn about parts of post-war London, things that I didn't know, about the munitions factories along the Thames waterways, and how they were then stored in central London. All sorts of intriguing things about, it turned out that his mother was very involved with radio programs to Europe, and all very different from any other sort of history that I've read about post-war London.
In the interview in The Listener with him, where they rang him up and they asked him about it, he sort of explains his way of writing was he was a researcher, and he would find a story and then write the story would develop from this without any plotting. He would just it would emerge organically,
yes,
and then he'd find people taking over, like the moth. The story's becoming his story, and then he'd have to rein him back in, and then he would weave in his research with these extraordinary tales, as you've mentioned, but with a poetic sort of sensibility that it sounds great to the ear when you're reading it. It is quite beautiful.
And I think, one of the other themes is the whole business of sibling relationships and the fragility of sibling relationships. As you mentioned, Julie, Rachel was 4 years older than...
a couple of years older,
than Nathaniel. And, as the eldest of 7 offspring, the challenges of sibling relationships it never ends, and I think to be able to convey that in the way he has done in this book is really very, very clever,
very remarkably well written. One of the things about their abandonment, Nathaniel was able to reconnect with his mother when she did finally come back into their lives, but Rachel could not. She could not have anything. She hated their mother and would not have. She never spoke to her again.
I found I was really curious about the mother, the secret agent, and obviously involved with. We suddenly get mentions of sort of Vienna or Berlin, or and sort of.
And Yugoslavia comes into it.
That's right, and so she's living this extraordinary life, unbeknown. And the ramifications of this, that enemies will become tracking back towards her to do harm to her and her children, has a certain sort of, but it's all so understated. It's
so subtly unfolds, and I just couldn't put it down. I just was. If I had to go off and do something, I'd be back, and it was
always a sign.
It was always a good sign. But it was the story was so involving and so mysterious, and what on earth is going to happen next, and what about him, and what about her, and how did this all link in with that? And he really holds it all together as an entire narrative. So many threads. I think he's very, very gifted writer.
Well, one of the other threads was how that development of spies and spooks at that particular time, how it all developed over a long period of time, often through childhood friendships.
Yes.
Which I found quite extraordinary, because I have no doubt that was in fact a lot of the case. And so that secret service work is... You have to wonder if there are people, and I'm sure it probably happens today, people being positioned out, sort of have the finger pointed at them. That now they'd be a good one to do that, and they're all chosen for particular abilities or knowledges that they have. It may be rock climbing. You know, it may be being able to listen. It may be able to communicate with a wider audience. All maybe knowing all about birds
and charts. He was very into charts and maps and
and being able to drive taxis helter skelter through black London with no lights.
Yes. Just and deepest rural Suffolk too.
And the whole story about
and the Americans, the American airmen in Suffolk. They often got lost because there were no signs and there were no street lights or anything. They didn't know where they were.
And they were, of course, all taken down because of the Germans. If the Germans landed, they weren't going to give them any clues about where they were, but it really was difficult for those who were living there to get from A to B.
Yes. And what I found interesting was that the mother, what was her name? The mother, I can't remember her name. Oh gosh, anyway, she couldn't, so she'd been the spy during the war, but she couldn't then leave it. She couldn't just go back to civilian life.
That was never going to work for her.
Wasn't ever going to happen, yeah. What was her name? Rose, wasn't it?
Yes.
Rose.
And I think that's very thought-provoking for all of us in our lives. And that's probably why it resonates. So I think now we're coming, we've got a few minutes left, and I think what we'll do is go through what everybody has been talking and focusing on. My focus was Warlight by Michael Undachi.
And mine was Winged Helmet, White Horse by Karen Hay.
And mine was Haruki Murakami's Killing Commendatori.
So thank you, Gareth. Thank you, Julie. And we look forward to repeating our Book Lovers Corner Tuesday of next month in February. And we will be welcoming Sue to our team, Sue Lawrence from Elmo's, who will be joining us. And we'll look forward to meeting again then and talking about what we've been doing in the last months for you, the listeners. Right. Goodbye, Gareth. Goodbye, Julie.
Goodbye.
Goodbye, listeners.